Welcome to the EdRed Podcast, a podcast discussing important issues impacting Illinois public education and the action being taken to address them. Each month, a new episode will be released featuring education experts.
The EdRed Podcast is co-hosted by Bridget Peach and Arabette Hernandez of EdRed.
Welcome, everyone, to the EdRed Podcast. Today, we are joined with Eric Santos to talk about AI in K-12 education. Eric, do you want to start us off with a quick introduction of your background in this work?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. My name is Eric Santos. I work for the Learning Technology Center of Illinois. We're an ISB grant program that provides ed tech services and support to educational institutions throughout Illinois. And my role is Regional Ed Tech Coordinator. So I work in the Chicagoland area, providing those services to schools and the regional offices and ISCs around Chicagoland. It's my 18th year in education. I started as a middle school science teacher, moved into ed tech as a tech coach, and now 3 years with the LTC. And I've been doing training on AI for the last year and a half, 2 years.
So Eric, some of our members might already know your name and who you are. You were a speaker at our kickoff luncheon, and then you joined us this past month in June for the first ever EdRed and Lake ROE Summit. But there might be some people that are newer to the conversation or newer to the space. I guess just for the basics 101, what is it that we're talking about when we say AI in education?
Yeah, great question, because a lot of people are surprised to hear that the term artificial intelligence has been around since 1955, right? And the concept of AI, the concept of machines being taught to think for themselves, has been around since 1950. The reason it's a big deal now, obviously, if you've heard of ChatGPT, a company named OpenAI released ChatGPT at the end of 2022. It's what's known as a generative AI tool, so it can generate its own content based on its training. And that was released, and 5 days later, 1 million public users had signed up for its service, which is the biggest tech adoption on record. So that's why we're really here talking about AI at all now, because that, of course, spurned all the other big tech companies to make heavy investments in AI. And obviously, education is a space that technology companies are keen to become a part of. In terms of your question of what does AI in education mean, that's a moving target, as with many things in education, right? So adoption of AI tools and understanding of them are all over the place. The last year has been the AI world tour for me, as I'm going district to district, just doing training and introductions to teachers and admins. But even as that's happening, the landscape continues to change. I have to update that presentation every couple weeks to keep up. So right now, what AI in education means is starting with the use of those generative AI tools by teachers and of students. So for teachers, it's really about using large language models as well as some teacher-focused tools that are out there for efficiency and personalization. Those are the two big levers that you can pull. And again, many teachers are just getting started seeing how, hey, I can write lesson plans with this tool. I can quickly create leveled text with this tool. I can find accommodations for this specific student. And so we're at the place where minds are being blown just seeing what it can initially do. But it's still in an infancy. I teach teacher certification courses at 2 universities, and I don't see it showing up that much as part of teacher prep quite yet, right? And that's something I'm learning how to integrate. So I think it's still very much at its infancy, and people are figuring out how it's used. I think at the admin level in educational institutions, obviously policy is a word that we hear a lot, concerns about misuse, safety, and ethics. So I think when we think AI in education, we have to think those things as well, because that's what our leaders are thinking. But what's interesting about AI and the education space is that, unlike a lot of other tech tools or technology in general, it's immediately become ubiquitous. Like, AI tools are embedded in the things teachers use every day. It's in Google Docs, it's in Google Slides, it's in Edpuzzle, it's in Kahoot. Like, the things that we're using, there is no opt-out. There is no choice to use AI or not AI. And increasingly, that's going to be the case. It's just integrated in the functionality. I think that's kind of where we're at now. Anyone in ed tech is familiar with the SAMR model, SAMR, and it's a model for how technology is adopted into educational institutions, into classrooms. And so I think right now we're at the S and A level of AI in education, meaning S for substitution, A for augmentation. So educators are figuring out how AI can do the things they're already doing better, faster, easier, and maybe making things a little bit better than they were, right? So that's S and A, like just initially substituting previous work teachers used to do with AI and making it better. But eventually, I think where we're going is more of the M&R, which is modification, redefinition of what education looks like. So eventually, I'd like to see us get to a systemic level where we're using AI to have personalized tutoring for students, something that would level the playing field and help students get more one-on-one interaction that they might not get based on not being able to have access to tutors at home or not, or being in a classroom that has more students in it, per teacher compared to the classroom down the street. I'd like to see data analysis of student test scores, student data, and better predictive features and better targeted responses to intervention for students. More content generation that doesn't rely on any one publisher or any one source, that allows us to quickly pivot when things change and create new content for students. So I think that's kind of where we're at. I think where we are going to find ourselves is a bit of an existential crisis in education and in schools. I think every time that there's a new technology that replaces any kind of human skills or even augments human skills, I think we as individuals feel a bit of that crisis of, well, who am I as a human if this AI system can do that? And where is my value? And am I comfortable with this thing doing this thing I used to do? And I think schools are going to have to deal with that crisis as well. If we've been spending so much time and energy teaching how to write an essay, and I can hit a couple buttons and get an essay produced, where does that leave me as a teacher? And what is the value of human work and the struggle of creating human created art and human writing? And where do we end and the AI begin? And I think that's kind of in the bigger picture, the bigger, scarier answer to your question. I think that's where AI in education is right now. It's figuring out what our role is as educators and as a school system.
So you touched on a lot of the potential benefits of AI in education, specifically for teachers, for students. Not to bring the mood down, but what are some of those risks? You quickly referenced, safety for both teachers and students, but can you dive in a little bit of the risks that might be coming up in some of the classes that you're teaching, and the concerns that follow?
Yeah, definitely not a mood killer. I think that's an important component. One thing that I love to show in my presentations is Gartner's hype cycle of technology adoption, and it's this graph that shows how people's have these inflated expectations of new technology that get to this peak, and then we realize it doesn't quite do what we thought, or there's a lot of downsides, and then we start to tank in terms of our expectations. So that's a great one to Google for anyone listening. A few other benefits I didn't mention: the complexity of being able to analyze complex ideas and produce new ideas based on complex data, the ability to quickly curate information. I think all those are great, creating, educational content. But I think the challenge, some of the big challenges, the first thing people think of when I used to do these sessions and I'd ask people to say a word related to AI in education, plagiarism was always the one that was plastered across the screen, right? It's interesting how over time that has gone more and more to the fringe and people are less worried about that. But I think it fits in a better, broader term called misuse. I think misuse of the technology is always going to be a concern. It doesn't matter what technology you develop, there will be those who use it for good and there will be those who use it for nefarious purposes, right? And so misuse covers both plagiarism as well as any negative uses, any intentions to use the tools for harm. And I think those have to be taken seriously. The risks also are that this technology is very much at its early, unpolished, raw stage. Anyone who's used, any of the large language models or any AI tool extensively has come across some mistake, some hallucination, right? Something unexpected, something that doesn't quite capture the entire idea, something that doesn't show sources. And I think that becomes a challenge. I mean, teachers who have been in the classroom the last 10, 15 years can attest to what it's like to have students do research and students cite their source as Google, right? Google said it, or they go to Wikipedia, which is fine as an initial information gathering source, but to rely on it, completely is not something we usually encourage, right? So I think now when you have a tool that can produce even more complex and seemingly complete and confident answers, and without always knowing what's behind the curtain, what's in the black box creating that answer, I think you have an even greater challenge and the irony of having such a powerful tool, but also not knowing if what it's doing is accurate and fair. So I think it creates an ironic greater need for fact checking and greater need for media literacy education, and ultimately a need for computer science education. Now more than ever, students need to understand how computing systems work, how AI systems work, so they can analyze how they're getting the answers and why they're getting the answers they are, and how those systems are trained. They're trained right now on human data and human language, and there's a plethora of it, right? You have to think over time as more and more content that's available is AI generated. At what point do the newer AI tools start being trained on AI generated content? So it's like the self-fulfilling prophecy. And because AI tools are not good at identifying AI generated content, even they will not be able to necessarily, at least not yet, sort out what's human created and what's real or what's accurate versus what is not. So I think those are a lot of the risks that exist. Don't know that we have answers to any of that quite yet. Obviously, bias is another one. Any system that is trained on anything on the internet is powerful, but also we know what's out there on the internet. There's a reason we have filters and restrictions in place on kids going on the internet. So when you have tools that are trained on everything out there, there's always the opportunity for bias to start showing up in the results.
As you noted, AI, it's human content that's plugged in, and that's how it's being generated. In recent years and recent months, people are coming out with the filters, especially in that space, and we're seeing like it's even like whitewashing certain images, things that are plugged in. With that being said, how can we use AI for diverse students and staff? How does that show up for them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. You think AI is designed to do everything that we can do, but better, but that also includes doing better at being biased, right? For better or worse. And computers don't necessarily eliminate bias. Sometimes they can rationalize it, and that's a dangerous idea. And so, again, if you've got a system that's trained on years and years of historical data, that sounds like a good thing, but by nature, that data is going to be skewed, right? Who's represented in that data? Who's been omitted? What ideas have been already presented with a great deal of bias or discrimination? And then there's also the other end of it, like who's collecting and disseminating this? What implicit biases already exist that are going to get magnified? I'll give you a simple example that I like to show in my workshops is if I use an AI image generator, okay, so where I give it a prompt and it creates a picture. If I just ask it to create a simple human without a whole lot of demographic information given to it, what is the representative human that ends up being created in this image? What is their gender? What is their race? What is their size, shape, color, everything, right? And no matter what it chooses, it's going to get that wrong for a majority of the population. And so immediately people have a reaction to that. And so there's an interesting study that I saw recently that showed that people tend to internalize bias that they receive from AI prompts. And so it's not much different than going online and reading a news source that might be biased or reading information that's biased, and people are absorbing that and internalizing it. So how do we filter that out? How do we determine who is the representative human for an image generator to create? Who gets to filter that and based on what? There's so many ways to get it wrong more than there are ways to get it right. And that's a simple example, but I think it's one that's pretty easy to create and to visualize right away. Obviously, it goes much deeper than just creating pictures of people, but I think that one's symbolic. So, for example, in another case, let's say you're deciding how you're going to group students together in a classroom, or you're deciding which students in your grade level need the most support and what kind of support, or you're assessing students' needs for an IEP or some other kind of intervention. Are we basing our decisions on unbiased data? There's so much historical bias just in education that data can be misrepresented, misused. And now you're having a computer do complex decision making, and you're going to be left with biased choices. So it's almost like garbage in, garbage out, right? Bad data in, bad data out. And removing the human element of that, I think, does you more of a disservice, right? Because ultimately teachers say, we know best. We're on the ground there with students. So we want to make those final decisions. Another example, if you look up the Gender Shades Project, it's a really interesting assessment of facial recognition systems. So AI systems that can scan faces or can scan body movement and motion and make determinations about, who a person is and what they're doing, what their intents are. And just to kind of summarize, it found that something like 34% more likely those systems were to misidentify someone if they were a dark-skinned woman versus a middle-aged white man. So there's some bias that's built in, and many places are scrapping those facial recognition systems. And then you ask why. Is it the data? Is it something to do with who's doing the training, who's doing the computer programming? Is it the leaders in the room who are signing off on the technology? We don't know. Where's the accountability? And I think that speaks to where representation matters as well, especially in the computer sciences and in technology in general. There needs to be diverse people with diverse backgrounds and perspectives having a seat at the table, both in the development of that technology, as well as being in the driver's seat of making the decisions about the application of that technology. So I don't know if that directly answers your question. I went on a bit of a tangent there, but bias in AI and bias in technology could be an entire hour-long podcast of its own and more.
Stay tuned. what I think is really interesting though is anytime I hear you speak, Eric, and you talk about some of these topics, what I keep coming back to is all of these issues and risks, they're not new. These are issues that within regardless, take AI out of it, our educational system is always confronting. I think of some of the sources I've read that talk about like math problems, like word math problems of the harm that is created when saying Jack and Jill have 4 apples. Jack gives his friend Ben 3 of those. How many? Just using Jack, Ben, Jill is otherizing community. So these risks and these cultural issues that we're confronting in the AI space, they're not new. It's just a difference in the context. Which brings me to our next question, which is, in general, the goal of schools is to create that culture of trust, of academic integrity, the focus on really looking at our students and seeing how best we can support them to succeed. So putting it in the context of AI, what are some policies and not necessarily recommendations, but what are you seeing in the world of policy, school district guidelines, recommendations on how to create that culture of trust within the world of AI?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, especially that you use several different words in addition to the word policy, because that policy is like the blanket, like umbrella word that administrators come in, and it's one we all understand. But I tend to think that guidelines and structure or recommendations are a much better way. The word policy, of course, is related to the word police, right? Policing and punitive and control. And I think that's in this case, it's just not even possible, much less is it useful if we're talking about a culture of trust. The interesting thing about AI and its emergence is that, for one, we're all, to use that COVID term, we're all building the plane while we fly it, right? No one has the right answer. There are districts around me that have full guidelines and training for teachers and communications to parents, and their leaders will say, we don't know if we're getting it right, but we're trying, and that's a beautiful thing. So no one has the right answer. And if you're just now starting to have those conversations with your district, like at least you're in that place. And the big thing that I tell to leaders is something is better than nothing in this case. Oftentimes it's really easy as a leader to say, I want to wait until I really have a handle on this. I want to have something nice and polished to handle. I don't want to give teachers something that's incomplete. You run into this idea where you're spinning your wheels and really getting nowhere and doing nothing, right? And so teachers are, and as someone who was a classroom teacher for over a decade, I can tell you, they just want to know that you're talking about it and it's on your mind. Sometimes the silence about a topic speaks volume, and it gives the misconception that you are not sure what to do or that nothing is being done. And teachers want guidance. They want someone to tell them this is what's okay, or this is what you should do, or this is how you should handle this, or I think this student is using this tool to cheat. What do I do? Is someone going to have my back if I have to go to the parent about this? And so it's important to be comfortable not having all the answers. It's important as a leader to be comfortable flattening the hierarchy on decision making and allowing teachers to have room to have a say and room to have some flexibility. It has to be a conversation, a collaborative conversation with everybody in the staff, and a flexible one. Having that comfort to say, we're going to come with some guidelines. We want your input. These are going to change. This is a living document. We're figuring it out. There's going to be failures, and that's okay. We're going to support you in those failures. Now, to that end, I mean, and not to make a commercial out of it, but the LTC, we've been collecting a list of policies and guidelines and documents and things that districts are doing. So that's something I'm always happy to share with leaders. It's important, I think, also not to try to do this as an island, right? We're all figuring it out. And so each individual trying to figure out how to do this for their district is not the most efficient way. Like, let's collaborate, let's talk to each other. One approach I've seen is the stoplight approach, right? Where you think of red as being those things that we agree we're just not going to allow AI to be used for this specific task or this specific idea. There's your greens where we say, hey, we want teachers to use this green light, like go for it. If we empower you to safely use this tool for this, or students, we empower you to use this tool for that. But a lot of it falls into that yellow, and that yellow is what you need to define of like, we want it used, but with these guidelines or with this citation in place, or with these limitations or with this conversation. It's not easy. None of this is easy, but we're teachers. We do the hard things. That's what we do. And I think we also need to prioritize student empowerment, remembering that it just doesn't work to put our head in the sand and ignore a new technology or something new that comes on the scene, it doesn't work for us to try to ban something outright and act like it doesn't exist. Think of your student 5, 10 years down the road when they're applying for a job. And remember, one of our goals, right, is to get students college and career ready, right? So you have a student who's got all this set of skills and experience, and another student who's got equal skills and experience. One has been heavily taught in how to use AI to enrich what they do. The other has had no experience because the school has banned it. Every school they've gone to, they've not been able to use it. Which one is more employable? And I can tell you that most employers, and especially most tech employers, are saying lean into this. Education has to lean into this. Paralysis by analysis is what you want to avoid in this case. So not thinking so hard about getting things just right that you end up not making any moves or any choices. I think again, something is better than nothing, and just get that conversation started and be ready for it to continue throughout the year.
I really like how you stated to enrich the skills that they already have. I think that's a key thing to consider, and especially in a field for our teachers, talking about staff in that sense, it is very realistic that educators have seen a burnout, right? So any support that can be provided to alleviate that, to not make the workload so heavy and make their life a little bit more manageable, I think is a great thing. So it brings me to a question that I had. How do we measure student learning if AI is integrated?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that one. I want to also just kind of jump into something else you mentioned that is going to take me on a tangent, but you mentioned about teacher burnout. And I think that is huge to talk about. When we talked about the benefits earlier, I skipped this part and I want to circle back to it. As someone who teaches, again, teacher prep programs, teachers who are getting their first shot in the classroom or in their first year, I can tell you the burnout is real. The amount of tasks they have to complete and the cognitive overload is real. There's a really great, it's a little older now, but this study by a company called TNTP called Leap Year that dug into the research on teachers' performance and essentially, to summarize, initial performance that first year predicts future performance. So teachers who are able to rapidly improve in their first year of teaching and handle the workload and get better are more likely to be successful later, and of course, more likely to stay in the profession. And I think most leaders listening could probably attest to the teacher pipeline problem and the workforce retention problem we have, especially post-COVID, right? And so fixing that teacher pipeline right now, to me, I think AI is a great opportunity to do that. I was involved with National Louis University with an AI research project where we used AI. We taught a group of students how to use it for lesson planning, and then measured how well it helped them. And I think being able, as a professor, being able to crank out a bunch of lesson examples about any topic, any grade level quickly is a huge help to me. But having teachers being able to know how to generate them, generate specific components of a lesson plan, generate examples in certain formats that they can quickly learn from, I think that's huge in reducing their workload, reducing the stress and anxiety of lesson planning, which for those of us in education for a while, lesson planning is second nature. But let me tell you, it's rocket science to a new teacher. So streamlining that is just so important. But so here's here's my segue into your other question, which is you asked about measuring outcomes. And even in our research study, it was difficult for us to figure out how to measure the outcome of whether or not use of AI was truly helpful to them. It was hard to gather that qualitative data or quantitative data. The qualitative seemed to indicate it was, teacher feedback. But to answer that question, measuring the outcomes, the educational outcomes. Again, like you mentioned, if you take AI out of that sentence, right, and you're just asking how do we measure the impact of blank on student education, we don't have solid answers on that either. It's constantly the debate, right? How much does this program or this approach impact their educational outcomes? There's so many variables in education. There are so many moving parts in any classroom. It becomes difficult to measure that outcome. I think we have a problem in education of transference of success. What happens here in this situation that worked may not work a school over, a district over, a state over, because there are so many parts that are outside of our control. Any teacher who's been around long enough has experienced the newest, greatest solution that we all get trained on, and we all invest ourselves into, and we all start doing in the classroom and measuring and basing our performance on, only to see that idea and the investment in that idea slowly fade away and the new thing come around, right? You talk to those teachers who have been around 30 years and they'll tell you that this isn't new. I remember this 20 years ago when we called it that. So I think that alone speaks to how difficult it is to determine what is going to impact education. So I think step one is figuring out how you as a school measure success. I think that's part of our biggest challenge is not just the methods we're using to impact education, but how are we measuring what that impact is? And I think it's important for leadership to be honest and transparent about it and to be consistent in what we're saying is our measure of success. So, for example, if your school website shows student creativity, hands-on projects, experiential learning, project-based things going on, but all of our staff meetings, we don't talk about any of that. The evaluation system and the meetings are 100% about test scores and how we're going to move the needle with numbers. And this is not to say one approach or the other is the right one and the other is the wrong one. It's just you have some cognitive dissonance there where you're sending one message about what's important, but then focusing energy on a different message between the public versus teachers and students. That first step of deciding what does success look like for us is the first step. And I think once you've done that, then you can start moving backwards and determining, okay, so now how do we impact that goal? And let's be clear about that. Again, take AI out of the sentence. We can ask ourselves, has technology as a whole improved educational outcomes? As someone who's in ed tech, I don't know the answer to that either. Are we truly changing students' lives? Are we really making the system better? Or are we just running to keep up with an ever-changing world that we're sending them out into? We've got schools who have been one-to-one laptops, take home, for years, and there's schools in my area that are still struggling with consistent internet access. They're still struggling to get Wi-Fi hotspots into students' homes so they can do homework. They're still struggling to have good enough consistent internet access to do the state mandated testing, right? So that inequity hasn't changed. It's just, the landscape has changed in which that inequity shows itself. A glowing rectangle on every desk and in every backpack doesn't necessarily change the outcomes, especially if a teacher in one classroom uses it in one way and the teacher down the hall uses it a different way and the other teacher across the hall doesn't use them at all. It's still just a tool. So the question is, have we closed the gaps? Have we defined what success looked like, and have we truly closed the gaps? And I think that's challenging. And so none of what I just talked about was AI, and I think that's an important place to start. This is a catalyst, I think, for schools taking a good look at what they're doing and why they're doing it and starting there.
So to dive a bit deeper into how you get to that culture of trust and getting those guidelines and knowing that you're not going to be perfect because we don't live in a perfect world. What role can or should the student play in that? I mean, I'll be honest. I joke whenever I'm out and, I'm with a group and we want to get a picture taken. We look for the youngest person around, you look for the person that, won't have any questions about, where to take the picture, how to take the picture. It's a silly example, but I also know that students are going to be looking at this technology. They're already using it. And schools don't want to constantly be playing catch up if they can avoid it, or at least reduce how much they're playing catch up. So what do you see as the student's role in the creation of guidelines or even the implementation within the classroom of this technology?
It's a great question. I'm going to start first by busting a bit of a stereotype here, right? And I one that I'm guilty of too, and that is assuming that young people are the most technology savvy in the room always. The undergrad courses I teach, like I'm consistently mistakenly expecting they're going to come in with a base level of tech knowledge that they don't always have, and I find that I have to teach them some of the basics of like, hey, screen recording yourself talking is an expected teacher skill post COVID. Understanding how to navigate in Google Drive or whatever ecosystem you're going to use. Like, this is just part of the job now. And I have to be reminded that if no one's taught them, you can't assume they're going to know. Listen, my dad calls me for advice on how to like program his Roku or whatever. I'm like, I have no idea. And he's like, I thought you're in tech. You're younger than me. Like, and so he's got this idea that I should just know all the tech things. And of course, now he thinks I know nothing because I don't have the answer to his very specific question. But all of that to exemplify that, yes, there's going to be kids who come across it. My 11-year-old loves to make like fake Pokemon characters with AI image generators, but does he know how to like use it to make his essay writing better? No, right? And so the message that I always give to teachers on that is to democratize, don't demonize, right? It is not our job to try and stop students from using the technology, but it is our job to prepare them. And if not us, then who? And if you don't teach them how to use AI tools, are you effectively indirectly creating an inequity? Because you've got students who will go home and may have access to the tech, may have access to Wi-Fi, may have parents who are supportive and teach them and guide them. And so they get that education, but those students who don't have that at home are missing out. And now you're indirectly creating a long-term inequity. And so it's up to us. And I know teachers, like, everything ends up becoming one more thing to put on our plate. But the reality is, if not us, then who? And so I think the first step is making sure that teachers are on a level playing field. That's kind of a role that I tend to play when I go into districts, is just like, hey, we know we've got some superstar teachers that are already using it daily. We know we've got some who have heard of AI in the news, and that's about all they know. How do we get them? How do we fulfill that concept of a rising tide lifts all ships, right? So getting everyone a base level of experience using the tools and knowing what they can do is step one. I think most teachers, this is a great win because they immediately see something that saves them time. How often does a teacher go to a professional development, especially when they didn't sign up for, and feel like you just saved me a ton of time versus you cost me some time, right? So it's an easy win to get people on board, at least with the idea. I think from there, what I tell teachers is you have to get accustomed to the tools. Even if you don't plan on using them a lot, you have to know them well enough, right? You have to know them well enough. If you're concerned about catching kids cheating, then you have to know the tool. You have to know your enemy. But if you really want to be successful, then you have to know the tool and be able to talk with students about it. I think that's where some planning on an administrative level is helpful, because you want to have kind of a unified approach to what tool are we going to invest ourselves in. Obviously, SAPA and privacy laws means you can't just throw any tool in front of students. You need to make sure it's something that's approved and something that's safe. But I think carefully curating a tool that kids can use for good and intentionally incorporating that into classroom is important. I think teaching them, again, that computer literacy. So Illinois has legislation now requiring the teaching of computer literacy standards, and they have a set of guidelines that are great, that lay out what should be taught. And they just recently edited those to incorporate AI as part of computer literacy. It's not really specific on what or how, but I think that's kind of a good thing. It sets the floor rather than the ceiling, right? So schools can decide how they're going to impart AI knowledge onto students. And I think, again, this is a case where starting with something rather than thinking we need to wait 2 years till we have a fully structured plan rolled out is the better approach. Like, let's get something in front of kids. I've got a great deal of resources I can share that can help teach how AI systems work, and how students can use them to their benefit. So I think that's super important. I think that communication with parents as well is important. I've done a few parent nights that I think were very well received, where they just brought parents out and said, hey, what do you need to know about raising a child in an AI powered world? Here's what you can expect your student to experience in school. Here's what you can do at home. Here are some apps you can use to help them with their writing. And I think parents really appreciate being included in that conversation and being empowered to support what schools are doing.
We already see a lot of gaps when it comes to just access in general for kids who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And the earlier it starts, it seems like the longer it lasts. And when you referenced the reality of they might not have access to stable internet today, what does that look like when they're out looking for a job and they're immediately coming at that disadvantage? I mean, this is a decades on decades compounding inequity, and schools can't solve it all. We all try. Every single school is straddled with, strapped with all of the social issues and, fix it. But the reality is we are serving students at such a high stakes time in their lives that will have lasting impacts on the rest of their lives. So I know that there are resources, and it may not be through LTC, but it may be through ISB regional offices. What are some of those resources that exist that are available to schools that serve these students? And every school serves these students, regardless of how many there are socioeconomically disadvantaged kids in every district. So what are some of those resources that are available? Or even, have you heard of any districts working with local, community groups even to address some of these gaps?
So let me answer that after. I do want to touch on something else you said real quick, because you mentioned we jumped back into policy, right? And just to kind of piggyback what you said about trying to generalize policy so that it's not immediately obsolete. The first thing I do when I work with admin teams and developing their guidelines and policies, I tell them, pull out your AUP document right now. Like, let's look at your user agreement that you already have in place for technology use. And you may be pleasantly surprised to find that the language you use there already covers AI. Like, there's nothing new that AI is going to do that isn't already covered. It's kind of like the medical statement of do no harm for doctors, right? Like, That's a simple 3 words that is very umbrella that can cover everything. And so, and if not, then it was time to update those policies anyway, right? I think the challenge is writing something that stands the test of time and change. And I think that's a valuable place to start. So I just want to comment on how much I love that statement and how that's something I like to incorporate as well. In terms of the equity piece, I think generally speaking, like I said, like democratizing it and taking it on as something that we're going to teach is important. I think you look at schools and how they're addressing some of those existing technology equity gaps. Schools want students to have laptops in their hand, so they go one-to-one, and they realize we can't send homework home. We can't expect a level playing ground outside of the area we control, so we need to send those devices home as well. Well, they can't send them home if the kid can't get on the internet. So you know what? We need to work with the community and with providers to get broadband to all students, or we need to figure out how to get hotspots home. So with every piece where we try to improve what we're doing, we realize that we can only control what we can control. And so we end up having to control a little bit more and giving them that access. And so I think this is just another extension of that. Like we're going to take on incorporating AI. So let's make sure that we do that and we do that fully and equitably amongst everyone. And it requires those other steps that I said as well, making sure they have a device, making sure they have internet access, making sure they have appropriate training and understanding. There's a lot of really good resources out there. I'm happy to share a document with you that has a lot of them, but there's a few that I share in general. The Department of Education actually has a really good website. Their Office of Ed Tech has an entire AI website. It's tech.ed.gov/AI, but it has a really great artificial intelligence site that has a load of documents and a whole lot of guidance for leaders and for educators, a lot of really good resources and videos to watch to get you up to speed. And so that's a great starting point that, of course, has an education focus for understanding AI and that entire space. There's a few others out there. Teachai.org is a great place to go for foundational ideas on policy and with AI in education. They even have presentation materials that you can go and you can download. They have talking points. So if you're looking to get in front of people and you want to make sure you're well prepared, they have a lot of stuff that's ready-made for you. I know IPA, the Illinois Principals Association, has a handbook that's out there. UNESCO has another site that has documents, and sometimes I use those for education institutions to do a little self-assessment on where they are in their AI adoption. COSIN has a great readiness checklist that you can print off and do with your staff or with your leadership to help you prepare for generative AI readiness. So there's a list of them. I'm happy to share those out. But even more so, what I love is that there's districts who are already putting out their policy. They're already putting out there publicly their guidelines. And so anytime you can see others approach, a lot of times you find that, hey, we're not too far off. Like we had the right idea. And I think we can follow that lead a little bit. There's a handful of states I can share as well, maybe about 10 to 12 states that have a statewide policy document or at least some guidelines published. And so those are great to look for as well. I don't want to be giving too much free marketing to different companies and then slighting others that I forget to mention, but there are several organizations that have student-facing AI tools that schools are evaluating and then adopting that will give students real-time feedback on their writing or give them access to like a curated chatbot in specific topics. So that again, creating that equity piece where every student has access to it in a safe and structured way and access in a way that's necessary and helpful to them. I say that, the same way that schools evaluate software for every other need, I'm now very quickly seeing them put into their budget a need for AI-based tools and the time and effort needed to evaluate those tools and figure out what's best for their district. And so that's just a part of what we're doing now. And then there are some great things that are showing up, so I can include that list as well.
That would be great. And we'll make that available to those listening, to EdRed members. Thank you, Eric, so much for joining us. This has been a really great conversation, going further in depth and talking through some really important pieces. I'm sure by the time this comes out, there'll be even more to discuss. But we really appreciate, the work you've done for the state of Illinois, but also joining us for our events, joining us for this podcast. We really appreciate, our partnership in this work. So thank you. And we'll wrap it up there.
All right. I love working with you all, so I appreciate the invitation and the conversation.